When I was a child, everyone I knew has participated in a terrible prank that was pulled on me. I'm aware of the fact that it would be a good idea for me to discuss this matter with a therapist. I would, or I have been, but that is no longer a viable choice for me. As a matter of fact, I have lost count of the number of times I have already recounted this narrative to a variety of medical professionals. It has been 20 years since the event took place, and I am 30 years old now. All I want is for it to come to an end. I would say that I was a pretty average kid. All children are a little bit strange, and this child is no exception. My older sister and I had a relationship that was characterized by constant conflict, similar to that of two cats. After school, I would meet up with a couple of my close friends, the majority of whom lived on my street or on the block next to mine, and we would play together until it was time for us to have supper. The life that I lived was, for the most part, perfect. I believe that I played soccer at one point. To be quite honest, I have a great deal of difficulty recalling a significant amount of my upbringing. However, I recall that for my 10th birthday, I received a Nintendo DS, and we threw a large party in the garden. Almost everyone in the area made an appearance. Because my birthday was right before the end of the school year, which meant that the summer break was about to start, the atmosphere was filled with enthusiasm, and the evening was warm and felt more alive than other nights. We were running around while the adults were sitting around our small fire pit, which they had created a fire in, and enjoying some beer. I was given permission to stay up later than I normally would, and the other children and I chased fireflies and cooked marshmallows together until late in the evening. I can recall going to sleep feeling content, eager for the summer, and very drained. The ceiling above me was illuminated by the glow-in-the-dark stars and moons that I had stuck on it. It didn't take long for me to fall asleep. The day following my birthday, when I woke up, there was a peculiar feeling that, when it comes to the question of whether or not a person can be both a good person and a bad person at the same time, the answer is that such a situation is indeed possible. I was unable to identify the exact cause of the issue. That was not the reason. I had not experienced a nightmare. As far as I can recall, I had never slept as well as I did that night. I came to the realization that it was quite late. That has to be the reason. If it wasn't a day that I had to go to school, my mother would often wake me up at around 8 o'clock in the morning. She asserted that it is a positive practice to maintain a consistent routine of waking up early and beginning your day in a way that sets you up for success. I guessed that it was already around 10 o'clock in the morning based on the light that was flooding in through my windows and the slightly sticky heat that was present in the room. I grinned and got out of bed, pulling my legs out from underneath the covers. I was allowed to sleep in, so it must have been the last of my birthday presents. I had naturally wanted to get out of bed as early as possible on my actual birthday, but on the day before she had also let me to sleep in, so it wasn't the first time she had done so. I leaned my head out of the doorway and screamed out into the hallway, "Mom, is that you?" There's no response. My expression became one of displeasure. I could be certain that my father was already at work because it was Saturday, but my mother would not be there. My sister would not be at home either. The previous evening she had departed to spend the night at the home of one of her friends. I was perpetually envious of her because she was now 13 years old and had been given permission to enjoy sleepovers. I came to the conclusion that she must be outside in the garden, which is in the front of the house. I went out of my room after I'd changed into a shirt. I was able to detect the scent of coffee, but there was no coffee left in the pot. In addition, there were dishes in the sink, and a skillet had the remains of eggs still clinging to it. It wasn't strictly something to be concerned about, but it was unusual. There was usually something left over for me to eat for breakfast, even on the days when I slept in. I opened the front door and was ready to yell out to my mother, but I stopped in my tracks immediately. The mailman was standing halfway up our walkway. fresh blood was pooling beneath him, creating a horrible spatter on the ground, while he laid spread out on the cement in an unnatural position. I was at a loss as to what to do. I was unable to move. His face was turned away from me, and his limbs were contorted at such bizarre angles that they were ghastly to look at. He was raised into the air and then thrown back down to the ground with such intensity that it nearly looked as if somebody, perhaps some kind of all-powerful force, had done it to him. A few feet away from him was the package that he must have been in the process of delivering. The cardboard was dented and it was soaked in red liquid. I was not in need of any sort of assurance that he was deceased. It was not a question that was being asked. Prior to this, I had never saw a deceased person. Although my parents had only viewed horror movies on occasion, that was scarcely considered to be a significant event. I backed into the home and then locked the door behind me as I entered. I was unable to do anything other than move at a leisurely pace, as if I were calm because my body was in a state of complete disarray. My heart felt as though it were about to explode out of my chest, and my mind was running at an incredible speed. I shouted out once again into the home, which was completely silent. "Mom?" I asked, but my voice was cracking. "Mom, are you home? Something happened outside. Mom!" There was no response from anybody. The only sound that I could hear was the blood pumping in my ears because the home was far too tranquil. As I was walking toward my parents' bedroom, I had to support myself by leaning against the wall since I was trembling so much that I was barely able to stand up. "Mom," I forced her bedroom door open by pushing on it. The sound of it creaking was nearly loud in comparison to the silence that had been cast over the room. Gumbo, our elderly cat, who is a grayish color, wriggled her way through the crack and made her escape into the hallway, where she brushed against my calf as she was making her way by me. I saw that there was a bump in the bed. I was under the impression that they were simply pillows for a little period of time. Nevertheless, I soon came to the realization that this could not have been the case. The bed was made and every single pillow was there and accounted for, propped up against the headboard. "Mom, are you asleep?" Despite the fact that I had not been making an effort to avoid waking her, it was barely audible, as if I were whispering. I had a strong want to see her awake. Somehow, I believed that I was previously aware of this. There was a certain heaviness that was hanging in the air, as if the entire world had been covered with something that was devoid of life, heated and empty. I suddenly thought of a desert, a region that was so far away from everything, and that was absolutely empty of anything at all. Lacking any signs of vitality, I was completely taken by surprise when I reached for the blankets and pulled them back. It was as if an electric jolt had surged through my body. I felt that my bones, muscles, and every single one of my veins were 20 degrees hotter than they were supposed to be. Blood was all over the place. It was nearly impossible for me to find an area of the sheets that was not saturated with it. The cherry juice that we would occasionally make from the cherries we picked from the tree in our backyard seemed to be similar in appearance. We would squeeze the berries with our hands and laugh as the viscous syrup dripped down our wrists. Her eyes were not closed, they were open. She was going to let out a scream, or so it seemed, for her mouth was gaping wide open. As I stumbled backward, I nearly fell and I gagged. I had the sensation that my legs had reached the point where they would no longer be able to function. I made my way back to the kitchen in a state of confusion and dizziness. At this point, the eggs that were sitting in the pan appeared to be making fun of me. All of the instructions that my parents had given me about what to do in the event of an emergency had completely disappeared from my mind at this point. This felt more like a terrible nightmare than an actual emergency situation. To be on the safe side, I gave my arm a pinch. That was all there was to it. It was the neighbors. I was required to contact my neighbors, and the phone number was written on a sticky note that was located near the telephone. When I dialed the phone number, my fingers were trembling. After 3 rings, each of which felt like it took an entire year to complete, they finally answered the phone. I heard a noise that sounded like cracking, almost like someone was moving the phone around. "Hello?" I swallowed hard in an attempt to dislodge the lump that was stuck in the back of my tongue, but it was to no use. "Hello," I managed to choke out. "This is Jackson from next door." After I heard some quiet whispering, I detected a giggle of some kind. It was a suppressed giggle, as if they were attempting to keep it from escaping. The voice spoke, saying, "Hello, Jackson." I thought it was Mrs. Winston, the mother, but I was mistaken. "Is everything all right? Can I help you with something? Something happened. My mom." Mrs. Winston spoke in a soft voice, but there was something about her tone that made one feel as though something was profoundly wrong. "Oh, honey," she continued. My stomach began to churn. "Why don't you head on over here, HM? We'll figure out what's going on together." "Okay." I recall that she had not yet spoken any further when I ended the call. There was something about the sound of her voice that was making me feel uneasy. Nevertheless, I was at a loss as to where I should go next. I wanted to avoid having to pass past the mailman, so I quietly slid out the back door. Gumbo was watching me as I made my exit. I went to the door of the house next to mine and knocked on it. There's no response. I knocked on the door a second time. There is still nothing. I entered the flower beds and took a look into the windows. Someone was lying on the couch, and their head was leaned back as if they were looking up at the ceiling. I was under the impression that this was what was going on for a little period of time, until I noticed that their chest had been cut open, similar to the way it would be for a patient who was lying on a surgery table. So much blood, so many organs and guts, so much blood. The person who was wearing brown dad shorts and a pullover vest was Mr. Winston. As lifeless as the person who delivers the mail, like my mother, who is deceased. I suddenly felt overcome by something and forced my way through their front door. I'd not really anticipated that it would be unlocked, but it was, so I went flying into the room, landing on my stomach with my face slamming into the floor. There, lying in front of the telephone, was Mrs. Wilson, dead. I was face to face with her. She was also keeping her eyes open. One of them had a fly crawling across its white surface. It would stop to brush its hands together every few seconds as it crawled along. I had begun to shed tears. I was finally beginning to realize that this was not a dream, but an actual event that was taking place, and I was in serious need of my mother. When I came to the realization that my face was covered in her blood, I felt like I was going to throw up. I quickly got myself into a standing position. I tried to get it off of me as quickly as I could by swiping at it with my hands. After that, I licked my lips without even thinking about it. I girded myself to taste the blood on my tongue, which would have a flavor similar to that of copper, but I was horrified by the thought of it. However, it never did arrive. It was sweet. I approached my mouth with one of my fingers, which was crimson in color, with trepidation. I was shaking constantly, and I paused for a moment before doing so. That's great. My mind was overwhelmed with memories of baking with my grandmother, the sweet syrup that we would occasionally pour into the mixing basins, and other things. It was little more than corn syrup, and it was disgusting. My father worked on the opposite side of town. I rushed to his place of employment as quickly as I could. I was on the verge of fainting and completely covered in sweat by the time I arrived at the location. However, it had made it somewhat easier to arrive here because the route was absolutely barren of automobiles. There were a few of them, either parked on the side of the road or, on occasion, in the middle of the road, but none of them contained any individuals. There were a few among them that had blood on them, blood that is thick, crimson, and sticky. She had her head resting against the computer screen. She was the kind receptionist who was always sitting at the front desk and who never failed to give me candy whenever my father took me there. It appeared as if someone had taken out entire sections of her scalp, because her hair was matted with red fluids. I swiped my finger across the side of her head and then licked it before I could give it any thought. On top of that, it was also sweet. I was standing on the edge of something that I could not even begin to wrap my head around, and I felt as if my brain was about to crack apart. I shook the woman, trying to get her attention. She was as limp and lifeless as a rag doll. I violently pushed her, and she fell to the ground with a thud, her head hitting the tiles as she landed. I was crying uncontrollably. "Wake up!" I shouted at her at the top of my lungs. "I know you're not dead." Not even 1 inch of her body moved. Her lips was slightly wide and she stared without blinking. I rushed inside the room where my father often worked, looking for his work area. When I saw it, the only thing I could recall about its location was that it was situated in proximity to the wall, approximately halfway back. In each of the cubicles, there was a person who had died. They appeared to be somewhat at peace on occasion, as though they had been taken by surprise, but the most of them had been disemboweled in one manner or another. There were bones that were visible, blood that was splashed on the walls, and entrails that were hanging out. There were even a few people whose faces had been torn completely off. It was as if some kind of invisible force had descended onto the town and was wreaking havoc. However, all of their blood consisted entirely of corn syrup. I even went so far as to touch one of the organs in a moment of courage. This organ resembled a bizarre balloon that had lost its air, and it wobbled as I touched it. But it felt more like plastic than like a part of the human body. There was this one time when I would have sworn that I heard a giggle coming from behind me. I turned around quickly, but there was no one in sight. I came across my father at the water dispenser. He was leaning against the wall, and he was still holding onto the cone-shaped paper cup, albeit his grip on it was not very tight. He was looking directly in front of him, and blood was pouring out of his eyes, nose and mouth. It looked as though he had exploded from within. I reached over and placed my hand on my father's shoulder as I softly muttered, "Dad, this isn't funny. Please stop." I was able to make out a peculiar expression on his face through the crimson, but it was only with great difficulty, almost like a smile on one's face, similar to the smile that someone would only make if they were putting up a great deal of effort to avoid doing so. I made my way back to my house by walking down the center of the road and balancing on the yellow lines. I did this to give myself something to concentrate on, as I was reasonably confident that if I were to stop walking, I would not be able to resume walking again. When I arrived at the place, I got into bed and closed my eyes. I was at a loss for what to do next. I finally fell asleep, but it was a fitful slumber, after what must have been many hours of lying there. It seemed to go on forever. There was a somebody shaking my shoulder, and that is how I awoke. I yelled, and in a panic I scrambled to get away from them, my eyes wide open and my heart pounding with terror. My mother took a step back, beaming, and said, "Whoa. Sorry, buddy, I didn't mean to scare you." I was breathing with great difficulty. While I was clutching my chest, I gave her a thorough examination. Her disposition was that of perfectly all right. At the very least, that is the impression that she gave. Her gaze was radiant and joyful, and she was smiling as she stood there. She was wearing blue jeans and a white top, and her hair was done up in her usual style. What day is it? Her smile disappeared, and she scowled slightly. That was when I became aware of the aroma of bacon, which was drifting in from the kitchen. "It's Sunday, bud, remember? After 2 days have passed since my birthday, So it was true that yesterday had actually happened. What happened yesterday? She made a quiet tutting sound as she pressed the back of her hand to my forehead. Did one of those neighborhood kids you play with get you sick, honey? Do you feel okay? I was unsure of what to say, so I dropped it. I managed to convince myself that it was possible that I was indeed ill, and that it was entirely possible that what I had experienced was nothing more than a feverish hallucination. I was so grateful to see her that I no longer wanted to give any of it a second thought. I sat down at the table for breakfast between my sister and my father, and as I ate, everything seemed to be as it should be. When I departed from the house later on that day, however, I observed it. As we made our way up the walkway that leads to our house, we noticed that there was something pink on the pavement, a faint pink smear which gave the impression that something sweet, crimson, and sticky had been washed away not long before. I've already mentioned that it has been 30 years. I had been under the impression that I had almost completely recovered from that tragedy. I had questioned every single person I knew on numerous occasions about that day, but none of them appeared to have any clue what I was referring to. Yet even so, I had nearly given up on it, and it had never occurred again since that time. Not till today. When I entered my therapist's office today, it struck me as unnaturally silent. Most of the time there was music playing, generally something calming and gentle, and there were individuals in the waiting area as well as at the front desk who were typing on keyboards. However, as for today, there is nothing. There is not a single person. There is no sound. I was in a state of confusion as I entered Dr. Sheldon's office without permission. When was the moment when I came across her lifeless body lying on the carpet, with her blood splattered throughout every single wall, and even trickling from the ceiling? I am aware that it seems insane, but I tasted it right away. That's great. She had a bizarre grin on her face, and her eyes were open as I turned her over. I did something this time that I never would have imagined doing when I was younger. I examined her pulse. She is still alive. I am at a loss as to what to do. I am shocked that they are subjecting me to this once again. Do they believe that this is humorous?